most of us assume that being normal simply means acting in a way that helps us assimilate seamlessly into our society. It's following the invisible rules, blending in, and doing what is expected. But those invisible rules, they are not fixed. Under the situational approach to psychology, a behavior is only considered typical if it matches the specific context in which it happens. Screaming at the top of your lungs is a perfectly expected reaction if you're dropping down the first hill of a roller coaster. If you do that exact same thing while sitting quietly in a doctor's waiting room, it becomes highly atypical. Time also rewrites the rules. The historical approach shows us that attitudes and expectations change drastically from one generation to the next. What parents or grandparents considered highly rebellious behavior 50 years ago might barely register as unusual today. Geography plays a role too. In mainstream Australian society, a lack of eye contact might be interpreted as disrespect or deceit. Yet under the sociocultural approach, we see that in countries like Japan, a child looking an adult directly in the eyes is often considered rude and offensive. If our definition of normal is dictated entirely by arbitrary boundaries, like location, the decade we were born in, and the room we happen to be standing in, it becomes a moving target. It is far too subjective to serve as a reliable, scientific metric for identifying a psychological breakdown. Because cultural and historical rules are so subjective, psychologists naturally tried to find objective data. They looked for answers in the numbers. This is known as the statistical approach. It attempts to define normality strictly by how frequently a specific behavior or characteristic occurs within a given population. But there is a critical flaw in this math. If we look closely at the extreme right tail of this curve, we find traits that are statistically rare, but exceptionally positive, like child prodigies or elite athletes. Being mathematically uncommon does not mean a person is psychologically unhealthy, and the reverse is also true. Just because a behavior is highly common across a population, like chronic stress or sleep deprivation, does not mean it is actually healthy for the individual experiencing it. While statistics are great for finding population averages, defining psychological well-being entirely by mathematical frequency ignores the complexities of a person's lived experience. This brings us to the medical approach, which views psychological disorders through the lens of physical illness. Here, a person's mental state is determined by symptoms with biological, genetic, or neurochemical origins. Yet, relying entirely on this biological model creates its own set of problems. Critics point out that it risks pathologizing ordinary human quirks and medicalizing standard variations in how we function. By focusing strictly on neurochemistry and biology, this model often overlooks the intense social and environmental stressors, like poverty, trauma, or unstable homes, that contribute heavily to poor mental health. The situational, historical, cultural, statistical, and medical approaches each offer a different perspective on human behavior. But none of them are capable of defining normality on their own. Modern psychology addresses this gap through the functional approach. Rather than asking if someone fits a rigid mold of normality, clinicians care about a person's ability to operate relatively independently and function at a level expected for their age. This framework evaluates our daily living skills, known as adaptive behaviors. These are the positive actions that allow us to navigate gauge demands, cope with our environment, and interact effectively with others. We develop these adaptive skills through strong foundations, relying on resilience, secure attachments to caregivers, and supportive family structures. On the other end of the spectrum are maladaptive behaviors. These include intense tantrums, avoidance, or self-harm, dysfunctional coping mechanisms that ultimately impair a person's ability to adjust to daily life. These actions rarely start out of nowhere. When an individual faces intense early childhood stressors like trauma or severe environmental instability, the brain develops a fight, flight, or freeze response as a way of bracing themselves against the anxiety. Maladaptive behaviors are essentially survival mechanisms formed in a high-stress environment, but have now outlived their usefulness and interfere with a person's life. This means that asking what is normal is the wrong framework entirely for understanding human psychology. Shifting our perspective to focus on adaptive versus maladaptive behavior removes the societal stigma from the individual. It stops labeling people as defective for failing to meet an arbitrary cultural or statistical average. The ultimate goal of psychological assessment is not to pass judgment on what is wrong with a person based on arbitrary norms. It is to determine if their behaviors are helping them survive, and to figure out how to help them thrive.